Chapter 1. The Crimson Verses of Windermere Hall. The wind rolled in from the fells that morning, stirring the ancient ivy curling round the balustrades of Windermere Hall. A lake stretched silent and silver in the distance, kissed by a fog that clung low and mournful, as if whispering omens into the stones of the stately estate. Inside, the great house bustled with guests, all assembled for what should have been a tranquil literary weekend, a retreat for poets, critics, and patrons beneath the benevolent gaze of the Earl of Darnley. It was Lady Eugenia Darnley who had conceived the idea, a gathering of minds, a celebration of verse. "Art shall heal the soul," she had declared with theatrical conviction, raising her fluted glass toward the chandelier. Her husband, ailing and withdrawn, rarely left his study, but his name, and more importantly his estate, still held sway in the literary world enough to attract a glittering constellation of reputations. By the third day of the retreat, tensions crackled beneath the genteel surface. There were whispered rivalries, bruised egos, a manuscript that had allegedly been plagiarized, and a certain fiery-eyed poetess, Miss Celestine Vale, who scandalized the company with both her brilliance and the biting precision of her tongue. She had stormed out of a late-night reading the night before, her voice ringing through the hall like a blade through velvet. "You quote my line, sir, and I will see your blood ink it properly." Few took her literally. Until dawn. It was the chambermaid Elsie who found the body. The house was just beginning to stir, the kettle still warming in the kitchen, when her scream sliced through the quiet corridors. The room in question was on the second floor, Lady Darnley's personal library, temporarily given to the Earl's visiting nephew, Mr. Hugo Trentham, a literary agent with a talent for finding diamonds among gutter filth. Mr. Trentham lay sprawled across the Turkish rug, face down, his fingers clawing at the parquet. His ink-stained cuffs were soaked in red. A penknife protruded from beneath his shoulder blade, small, ornate, silver, and beside him, arranged neatly upon his desk blotter, was a folded piece of thick vellum paper, stained crimson at the edges. On it was written a single stanza. He sang of shadows never shed, of borrowed words and stolen bread, but verse once filched must blood repay, and ink shall drain where liars lay. There was no signature, but to the trained eye, the loops of the cursive, the flare of the R, it bore a haunting resemblance to Celestine Vale's hand. Within the hour, the hall was sealed. No one was to leave, not staff, nor guest, nor host. Inspector Graves from the local constabulary arrived, stiff-lipped and skeptical. "Poets," he muttered, as if the word were a diagnosis. "Always trouble where there's ink and vanity." He interviewed the immediate circle, Lady Darnley, wan and shaking but insisting upon composure; Celestine, pale but unflinching, insisting upon innocence; and the others, each nervous, each curiously poised between grief and performance. A rivalry here, a failed contract there. Financial motives, professional slights, romantic undercurrents that could only be guessed at. It seemed that everyone had a reason to dislike Mr. Trentham. But only one had left a blood-soaked poem behind. Celestine was confined to her room. The inspector called it precaution. Lady Darnley called it discretion. And yet, beneath the polished exterior of Windermere Hall, something darker stirred, something older than the library's stone hearths, more tangled than the poetry books stacked high in the study. Something ancient in its calculation. Because whoever had killed Mr. Trentham hadn't just committed murder. They had staged it, composed it. A literary execution. And, as the storm rolled in from the lake, sending ripples of thunder across the glassy waters, a car arrived up the gravel drive. Sleek, modest, efficient, out stepped a small, fastidious man in a dark wool coat and spats. His mustache was immaculate. His bowler hat tilted just so. In his gloved hand he carried a cane tipped with ivory, not for use, but as a matter of elegance. Hercule Poirot had received a telegram only hours before. The language had been terse, but the name Windermere Hall rang a bell. He had been acquainted with the Earl's brother years prior, and when the matter had hinted at murder and verse, Poirot had immediately sensed a deeper rhythm, one only the little gray cells might decipher. The butler greeted him solemnly. Poirot glanced up at the somber facade of the house, the windows like watchful eyes. "It is not merely the crime, no," he murmured. "It is the poetry of the crime that intrigues me." Inside, the drawing-room had become a staging ground. Inspector Graves regarded Poirot with the suspicion reserved for outsiders, who carried themselves with too much confidence. "Another consultant, eh? I suppose the London press will enjoy that." Poirot smiled gently, brushing a speck of dust from his lapel. "Non, monsieur. I am here merely to observe, to listen, and, if permitted, to suggest." The inspector grunted. "Well, you'll find your suspects all upstairs, each one with a motive. Each one a wordsmith. But it's the girl we've got our eyes on, mad as a wasp in a teacup. And if you ask me, the evidence is as good as a signature." Poirot's eyes twinkled. "And yet, a poem is not merely ink on paper. It is a voice, a mind, a fingerprint of thought." He paused. "And a forgery, I assure you, is a very particular crime." Poirot stepped toward the stairs, his mind already whirred. The poem, the knife, the arrangement of the scene. He had not yet spoken to a single suspect, and still something struck him as deliberate, not passionate, not desperate, but planned, and that, to Hercule Poirot, was always the most dangerous kind of murder. Chapter 2. The Crimson Echoes of the Library. The second-floor library of Windermere Hall bore the heavy stillness of a cathedral after midnight. Poirot stood just inside the threshold, glancing about with an air of thoughtful precision. The room was tall, dark-paneled, its shelves lined with dusty tomes that gave off the scent of age and forgotten wisdom. The curtains were drawn back, but the storm clouds pressing against the window panes dimmed the morning light, casting everything in a pewter gloom. At the room's center, the Turkish rug lay slightly rucked beneath the body's removal point. The faintest outline of Hugo Trentham's shape remained in the crushed nap of the carpet, surrounded by faint dark spots that had already begun to oxidize to a reddish brown. Inspector Graves had allowed Poirot access with a sardonic grunt and a muttered warning not to meddle too delicately. Poirot, for his part, treated the scene like a composer approaching a silent sonata. Each object, each mark, each absence of motion, a note to be heard. He stepped lightly to the desk, where the now infamous poem had been laid for inspection. The original had been secured, of course, but a photographic copy remained. Poirot leaned forward, hands clasped behind his back. He read the stanza again, aloud this time, each word carefully enunciated as though savoring the taste of a rare spice. He sang of shadows never shed, of borrowed words and stolen bread. But verse once filched must blood repay, and ink shall drain where liars lay. He finished and exhaled softly through his nose. The rhythm is precise, the imagery sharp. It speaks of accusation, but it is not the product of rage, no. It is a warning, a pronouncement, a ritual, perhaps. He turned his gaze to the inkstand beside the blotter. 2 pens sat carefully in place. The inkpot was open, and beside it, a smudge, a trail of red that had not dried cleanly like the rest. Poirot crouched, adjusting his gaze, tracing its direction. "It is curious," he murmured, "that the blood here is not sprayed or splattered. It is daubed, as though the scene were, how do you say, composed." The door creaked behind him. A voice, brisk and uncertain, cut through the silence. "You're the detective, aren't you?" Poirot turned. A young woman stood in the doorway. She was tall, with an angular elegance about her, dressed in a fitted navy skirt and blouse that suggested intelligence rather than ornamentation. Her hair was pinned back severely, though wisps had begun to fall loose. "I am Hercule Poirot, at your service," he said with a polite nod. "Marjorie Whitcomb," she said quickly. "I'm Mr. Trentham's assistant, or was." Poirot motioned for her to enter. She stepped cautiously into the room, her eyes flicking toward the desk, then the floor where the rug bore its haunted imprint. "I was the one who typed most of Hugo's correspondence. I filed his papers, managed his appointments. I would know if he had enemies." Poirot observed her carefully. She kept her arms tight across her chest, fingers twitching. "Did he have rivals?" Her jaw clenched. Of course. Hugo wasn't exactly gentle in his negotiations. He played authors against each other, promised more than he delivered, rewrote contracts without a blink. He said he was building genius out of chaos, but it made enemies. Poirot walked around the desk slowly. "And this poem, it was not written by him?" "No," she said at once. "Hugo didn't write poetry. He barely read it unless it could be sold. And this?" She motioned to the copy. "It's not his voice. It's far too cultivated, literary." Poirot gave a small nod. "And do you recognize the style?" She hesitated, lips tightening. "If I had to guess, I'd say Celestine Vale. She has that tone, florid but sharp. And she hated him, claimed he ruined her second volume, watered it down for middle-brow digestion. She threatened him last night in front of everyone." Poirot turned to the bookshelves, his eyes sweeping over titles. "And what was he doing here at the hall?" "He was reviewing manuscripts and scouting. Lady Darnley wanted him to publish an anthology from this retreat. She fancied herself a patroness of the arts. He was also managing her investments in literary journals, though that was complicated." Poirot arched an eyebrow. "Complicated in what way?" Marjorie shifted uneasily. "Well, there was tension. Lady Darnley's son, Lawrence, didn't like how much influence Hugo had, thought he was draining money, manipulating his mother. There was even talk of removing Hugo from the estate's accounts." "Ah," Poirot murmured. "So, money and control. Toujours the fertile ground for murder." She turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. Last night, I was in the south wing sorting Hugo's papers, alone. Around 10, I heard someone outside his door. A quiet knock, then nothing. Just silence. I didn't see who it was, but it felt deliberate." "Merci, Mademoiselle Whitcomb," Poirot said with a gentle smile. "You have been most helpful." After she left, Poirot remained in the library for several minutes more. He took note of the half-drawn curtain rope, one side pulled tighter than the other. A glint of something metallic caught the light beneath the bureau. A single cufflink. Not unusual, save for the fact that Hugo Trentham was not known to wear French cuffs. Poirot knelt, retrieving the item delicately. The crest was faint but familiar, an ornate D surrounded by laurels. He slipped it into a handkerchief and pocketed it silently. At that moment, a voice called up the stairs. It was Graves, sounding tired and annoyed. "Monsieur Poirot, the lady of the house would like a word with you, urgently." Poirot nodded and brushed a speck of dust from his sleeve. As he left the library, he glanced once more over his shoulder at the desk. The crimson-stained poem remained in its place, accusatory, elegant, and deeply composed. There was something theatrical about it all. A performance for a singular audience. A story told not just in words, but in omission. And Poirot knew, without question, that the murderer had not finished writing their tale. Chapter 3. The Circle Behind the Curtain. The drawing-room of Windermere Hall, once a place of cultured idleness, now buzzed with the quiet dread of waiting. The windows had been shuttered against the rising wind, and the ornate fireplace crackled half-heartedly, offering little warmth against the rising tension in the room. Poirot stepped inside with the bearing of a conductor about to begin a performance, his eyes scanning each face, not with suspicion, but with curiosity, a kind of private invitation to reveal something unintended. Lady Eugenia Darnley sat primly on a carved walnut settee, her gloved hands clasped as though clinging to etiquette itself. Her carefully arranged curls trembled slightly, though whether from age, grief, or fear. It was impossible to say. She wore pearls, not fresh ones, and a faint dusting of lavender powder still clung to the collar of her mourning gray dress. Across from her stood her son, Lawrence Darnley, tall, athletic, and every inch a disappointed air. His face bore the sculpted lines of old aristocracy, but there was something raw and restless behind the eyes. He leaned on the piano as if bored, though the knuckles of his right hand were white from gripping the edge. Near the drinks cabinet sat Dr. Felix Altamont, a literary critic of no small fame and considerable cynicism. His bow tie had begun to slip sideways, and his fingers trembled faintly as he lit a cigarette. A stack of proofs, annotated in red ink, poked from the side pocket of his coat. Then there was Miss Celestine Vale, coiled like a cat in the corner chair. Her black velvet dress clung to her frame with theatrical precision, and her lips, a shade too red, curled into the faintest smile. She stared directly at Poirot as he entered, unblinking, as though daring him to ask the question everyone else was skirting. Poirot paused at the center of the room, letting silence drape around them like a velvet curtain. "I thank you all for assembling," he said softly. "It is most unpleasant to be caught in such a drama, mais oui, but it is worse still to let shadows thicken in silence. So let us speak, not of accusation, non, but of understanding." Lady Darnley cleared her throat. "Inspector Graves has already conducted his interviews. I was told you're a friend of the family?" "An acquaintance, madame," Poirot replied, "but not here as a friend. I am here as a seeker of truth. I would prefer to speak with you all together, to hear what was seen and what was not." "Together?" Lawrence scoffed. "That's hardly protocol." "Ah, but the truth does not flourish in solitary soil," Poirot said mildly. "It requires light, and often the presence of others makes the tongue less guarded, n'est-ce pas?" Dr. Altamont flicked ash into the hearth and gave a short, hollow laugh. "If nothing else, it'll be entertaining. I was beginning to think we'd all rot in our rooms." Poirot gave a gracious nod. "Then allow me to begin with a simple question. When was the last time each of you saw Mr. Trentham alive?" Lady Darnley blinked. "I spoke with him yesterday afternoon, in my study. We discussed the anthology, and some of his dealings. He was frustrated. The poets were not submitting the kind of work he had hoped. He said the collection lacked danger." Danger? Poirot tilted his head. He meant edge, said Dr. Altamont wearily. He was hoping for something scandalous to boost sales. The man didn't read poetry. He gambled on it. And you, monsieur? Poirot turned to the critic. Altamont shrugged. I saw him at supper. He made a joke at Celestine's expense. Something about rhyme being dead and best buried with her career. Subtlety was not his strength. Celestine's voice sliced across the room like glass, and I replied that I would write an epitaph in his blood if he continued to steal from my manuscripts, which, I might add, he did. Lawrence exhaled harshly through his nose. You threatened him in front of everyone. I promised poetry, she said with a chill smile. Hardly the same as murder. Poirot raised a hand. Mademoiselle, did you retire early last night? I went to my room after supper. I wrote until late. She paused, then added, alone. Convenient, Lawrence muttered. Unlike Marjorie, at least. Ah, said Poirot, eyes narrowing slightly. Mademoiselle Whitcomb, the assistant. You believe she had cause? Lawrence turned away from the fire. Hugo treated her like furniture. She was infatuated, clearly, and he didn't so much as look at her unless it was to demand coffee or corrections. He humiliated her in public more than once. Don't let the meekness fool you. Celestine leaned forward, her eyes flashing. That is rich, coming from a man who called Hugo a parasite during cocktails not 48 hours ago. Lawrence stiffened. Because he was draining my mother's finances, and I had every right to protect the estate. It was my father's before it was hers. Lady Darnley looked away sharply. Lawrence, don't, he snapped. You allowed Hugo to crawl through our accounts like a rat. He funded speculative ventures with our family name. You let him. Poirot let the silence settle again before speaking. It seems, monsieur, that you had financial motives, and personal ones. I had motive, yes, Lawrence said, glaring, but not stupidity. Killing him would only taint the Darnley name further. I would never do anything so gauche. Poirot gave a slow, thoughtful nod, as if filing each reaction away in the mental cabinets of his mind. And the poem, he said lightly, did any of you recognize its tone, its structure? All eyes turned to Celestine. She gave a slow, theatrical shrug. I have written 1,000 poems, she said, some with rage, some with love, some with teeth. That stanza, yes, it has a rhythm that echoes mine, but that is what makes it clever. Anyone could imitate me. Hugo often did, without permission. Poirot turned to the fireplace, tapping one finger gently on the marble mantel. So, we have an assistant humiliated, a critic disdained, a poet betrayed, a son embittered, and a lady troubled. Lady Darnley closed her eyes for a moment. Monsieur Poirot, are we all to be suspects, then? Poirot's voice was soft. Until I know who is innocent, madame, everyone is a possibility. Even those with the steadiest hands. The grandfather clock struck 11. Outside, the wind was rising. Poirot looked slowly from face to face, as though capturing a photograph of their expressions in that exact instant. The tension, the fear, the arrogance, the artifice. Mercy, he said simply. This has been most illuminating. He turned to leave, but as he reached the door, a voice called after him. It was Celestine. You know, she said, Hugo always believed the truest poem was the one never written. He said it hung in the air, waiting for someone to die before it found a page. Poirot paused, then gave the faintest smile. Let us hope, he murmured, that this poem is not yet finished. Chapter 4. The Precision of Poirot. The drawing-room slowly emptied. Poirot remained standing in the hallway, listening to the retreating shuffle of footsteps on the grand staircase. Windermere Hall had grown quiet again, that strange silence of a house suddenly aware of its own secrets. The chandelier above gave off a low, porcelain clink, disturbed only by the occasional groan of the wooden beams. Poirot smoothed his mustache thoughtfully, one corner of his mouth lifting, not in amusement but recognition. A performance was unfolding before him, but the players, he sensed, had not yet grasped their roles fully. He returned to the east wing, where Lady Eugenia's private study waited like a locked drawer of a bureau, elegant, untouched, and harboring what others preferred not to see. The room was modest in size, but richly decorated. A mahogany desk stood near the window, overlooking the gardens now tossed by wind. To the right, a small portrait of the late Lord Darnley stared with cold eyes from above the fireplace. Lady Eugenia sat waiting, posture rigid, fingers folded in a way that seemed practiced rather than natural. A tea service had been set beside her untouched. Poirot entered without flourish and bowed slightly. "Madame," he said softly, "you wished to speak." She looked at him steadily. "Yes, because I believe something has gone terribly wrong here, and not just with Hugo's death." Poirot took a seat opposite her, legs crossed, hands resting lightly on his knee. "I am listening." She hesitated, as if choosing her words from a locked cabinet of emotions. "You must understand, I did not invite Mr. Trentham into our lives for pleasure. He was necessary. After my husband's death, the estate's holdings were in a precarious position. Lawrence had no interest in the family finances, and I was advised to diversify. Hugo came highly recommended." Poirot nodded. "He managed your investments?" "Yes, and began involving me in literary ventures, journals, imprints, even a small publishing house in Edinburgh. At first it seemed promising. Then he began using the Darnley name as leverage, making decisions without consulting me, pulling Lawrence's inheritance into speculative projects. And yet you permitted it?" Her eyes tightened. "I was unwell at the time. Grief, compounded by other things. Hugo took advantage of that. But when I began to regain control, I discovered accounts had been moved, promises made in my name." She paused. "I intended to dismiss him after this weekend." Poirot tilted his head. "Did you tell him?" "Not yet, but he suspected." She reached for the teacup, then left it untouched. "Yesterday morning, I found a letter slipped under my door. No signature, just 4 lines, not unlike the poem left beside Hugo's body. Only this one read, 'A house of verse cannot stand, where silence poisons every hand. Those who steal in whispered tread shall wake to find their names in red.'" Poirot's eyes narrowed. "You still have this letter?" She nodded and reached into her writing desk, producing a folded slip of thick parchment. It was similar in tone and paper to the one found beside Hugo's body. Poirot took it gently, reading the words aloud with a weight in his voice, then silently again with his eyes. "Have you shown this to the inspector?" he asked. "No," she said firmly, "because I don't trust him to understand what's truly happening." Poirot rose and paced slowly to the window, gazing out into the twisted trees of the garden. "And what is truly happening, madame?" Her reply came quickly. "Someone here is playing a game. A literary game, yes, but cruel, orchestrated, and not just to frighten us, to shame us. Hugo may have been their first piece, but he will not be the last." Poirot turned back to her. "You speak with certainty." "Because I know this house, monsieur. I know its people, and I know when something malevolent is taking root in the walls." He bowed again, deeply. "Merci, madame. Your honesty is most helpful." Leaving her study, Poirot walked through the hallways of Windermere with a measured grace, eyes scanning every surface, dust patterns on a console, a smear on the banister, the faint smell of burnt wax in the air. He did not move aimlessly. He moved as a reader does through a well-structured novel, noting every comma, every pause, every silence. He made his way toward the guest wing and tapped lightly at the first door. Dr. Felix Altamont's. The critic opened it after a moment, eyes bloodshot and breath heavy with tobacco. "Yes," he said, irritation poorly masked as indifference. "A brief question," Poirot said smoothly. "You were in your room after supper, no?" "I was," Altamont replied, "reading. Editing. Is that a crime now?" "Only if the poem you were reading was written in blood," Poirot replied with a faint smile. Altamont snorted, then leaned against the doorframe. "I knew Hugo was going to end badly. Men like him always do. They play God with words, but they forget the ones they steal tend to bite back." Poirot tilted his head. "You imply he had enemies among the guests. I imply nothing, but if you stir a pit of vipers long enough, one of them will strike." Poirot offered a small bow and turned away. "Merci, monsieur. You are a man who understands venom well." One floor above, Poirot continued to the far end of the corridor, toward Celestine Vale's room. He did not knock immediately. Instead, he paused, studying the door. Polished brass handle, no scuffs around the keyhole, no scratches on the threshold. Immaculate. A stage waiting for its actor. He knocked. A moment later, Celestine opened the door. Already wearing a silk robe the color of ink, she did not seem surprised to see him. "Come to ask if I murdered him in rhyme, Monsieur Poirot," she said with a languid stretch of her lips. "I come only to observe," he said, "and to ask. Would you mind showing me your notebooks?" Her eyebrow arched. Not many men ask that before dinner. Poirot smiled faintly. "And yet, they are the truest window to motive, n'est-ce pas?" She let him in. The room was dark, but fragrant with sandalwood. On the desk near the window, leather-bound journals were stacked high, a pen laid across the top like a relic. She handed him one without hesitation. Poirot opened to the middle and read silently. The penmanship was sharp, erratic at times, but unmistakably confident. He flipped 2 more pages and found something that made him pause. A passage in an unfamiliar style, stiffer, more stilted, mimicry, or perhaps a forgery. He closed the book gently. "Merci, mademoiselle. I will not intrude further." She smiled. "Do let me know when you've solved the mystery. I'd love to write the sequel." As Poirot returned to his room, night began to fall across Windermere Hall. The clouds had thickened, blotting out the moon. The halls were quiet. But Poirot, sitting at the edge of his bed with hands steepled under his chin, no longer listened to footsteps or wind. He was listening to language, because in the affair at Windermere the killer was not merely one who acted. No, this killer composed, with structure, with meter, with something far more dangerous than hate. They killed with intent. Chapter 5. Beneath the words, between the lies. The next morning dawned muted and colorless. The skies over Windermere Hall bleached with fog. A fine drizzle clung to the stone windows, whispering softly like secrets exchanged in hushes. Poirot rose early, already dressed immaculately, the cuffs of his shirt snow-white, his tie perfectly knotted. His mustaches waxed to symmetry. He had slept little, but thought much. The events of the previous day, the poem, the blood, the shadows within each suspect's voice, had coalesced not into answers, but patterns. Now he would begin to press. He requested the interviews take place in the morning room, a space filled with gray light and trimmed with rosewood panels. There were no shadows here, and Poirot knew the power of setting. A dark room encouraged secrets. A bright one forced revelation. Inspector Graves was absent, attending to a matter at the constabulary, and Poirot preferred it that way. His was a different sort of questioning, quieter, deeper, concerned not with contradiction of facts, but contradiction of character. The first to enter was Marjorie Whitcomb. She clutched a notebook to her chest as though it were armor. Her gray blouse was neatly pressed, but her eyes were rimmed with sleeplessness. She sat with a stiffness born not of pride, but caution. "Mademoiselle," Poirot began gently, "you were the closest to Monsieur Trentham in terms of proximity, no? You worked beside him daily." She nodded, not quite meeting his eyes. "Yes, I typed his letters, revised contracts, prepared reading schedules. And you admired him." A pause. "I thought he was brilliant, but not kind, not honest. I admired the idea of what he could be, not the man he became." Poirot folded his hands on the table. "You mentioned yesterday you heard someone outside his door, just a knock. Could you say more?" "I was in the south wing going through his correspondence around 10, she said slowly, voice low. "I heard faint steps in the corridor, then a knock. Light, 2 taps, then silence. I waited, but I didn't hear a door open or close." "No voices?" "No. And why were you working so late, mademoiselle?" Her fingers tensed around the notebook. He left things late. He would make changes at the last minute. Scribble margin notes. I was trying to be efficient. I didn't want him to be disappointed. Poirot inclined his head, watching her carefully. "And were you?" She blinked. "Disappointed?" "In him," Poirot clarified. "Was there a moment when admiration turned bitter?" Marjorie's lip trembled, but she quickly composed herself. "He took credit for things I wrote. Ideas, lines, edits, small things, but they added up. He once told me, 'You are the pencil. I am the prose.' I began to resent him for that. I think I wanted to leave. Did he know this?" She hesitated, then nodded faintly. "Yes, I told him 2 days ago I might accept another position." He laughed. "Said I'd be back within a month, humbled." Poirot watched her a moment longer. Her hands, her posture, the quiet restraint in her voice. Pain, yes. Regret, certainly. But hatred? That remained uncertain. "Merci, mademoiselle. You may go." When she had left, Poirot rose and opened the French doors slightly, letting in a breath of damp, fresh air. He disliked the scent of fear lingering in a closed room. The second guest was Dr. Felix Altamont. He entered with his usual blend of detachment and weary sophistication, a cigarette already perched behind his ear. "Ah, monsieur," Poirot said, "you are a man who sees words as weapons, no?" Altamont chuckled, "Only if wielded correctly." "What would you like to know, Monsieur Poirot? My childhood dreams? My feelings about the Oxford comma?" Poirot smiled politely. "Let us speak instead of Hugo Trentham. You did not like him." "No one did," Altamont said flatly. "He was an opportunist. Brilliant at business, yes, but utterly void of principle." "And yet you shared many ventures." "We did. I wrote, he packaged. He had reach, influence. I tolerated him." Poirot steepled his fingers. "Did he ever steal from you? As he did, perhaps, from Mademoiselle Vale or Miss Whitcomb?" "Not quite," Altamont replied, though he shifted slightly in his chair. He did, however, publish a harsh critique of one of my essays under a pseudonym, only to later offer me a column in the same journal. A game to him. A humiliation turned into leverage. Did you ever confront him? Oh, I threatened to slap him with a rolled-up proof. We laughed, but it stung. He knew it would. Poirot narrowed his gaze. And where were you at the time of the murder? In my room, reading Pindar. Boring, rhythmic, obscure, rather like this retreat. Poirot let a beat pass. And you heard nothing? Only the wind, and some distant arguing. A woman's voice, I think. Sharp, but not close enough to distinguish. Poirot took a small notebook from his pocket and jotted something silently. Then he looked up. And the poem, monsieur. The one found beside the body. What did you think? Altamont's eyes flicked sideways. Technically strong, written with theatrical flair, but too proud, too exacting. Whoever wrote it wanted to be admired, even in murder. Poirot made no comment, but he wrote again in his notebook. Merci, monsieur. You may return to your musings. The critic rose and gave a mock bow. I hope your little gray cells are not too dizzy yet, Poirot. This house has corners even the poets haven't touched. He departed in a gust of pipe smoke. Next came Lawrence Darnley. He entered with the gait of someone tired of being interrogated. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, and he looked more like a man returning from a tennis match than the heir of an ancestral estate. Let's get this over with, he muttered, folding his arms. Poirot gestured toward the chair. But of course. Tell me, monsieur, were you aware that your mother planned to sever Mr. Trentham's financial influence? Lawrence's brow furrowed. She did? She told me herself, Poirot said smoothly. I wonder why she did not tell you. Lawrence hesitated, the reaction flickering too quickly to disguise. She should have. I've warned her for months. Hugo was bleeding us. Slowly, subtly, but thoroughly. And you argued with him. Of course I did. I told him to leave. Once I nearly punched him. Poirot nodded. And last night? I was in the billiards room until around 11, alone. Then I went upstairs. Did anyone see you? No, and I don't care. I didn't kill him. If that's what you're getting at. Poirot leaned forward slightly. The poem, what did you think of it? Lawrence grimaced. Pretentious, like most of Celestine's work, probably her idea of artful justice. And yet, someone went to great lengths to make it poetic. Even you must admire the irony. I don't admire murderers, Lawrence snapped, standing, even poetic ones. Poirot did not stop him as he strode from the room. 3 interviews, 3 shades of motive, none quite whole, none without fracture. And yet, Poirot sat alone now, the morning room settling again into its cool silence. He tapped his fingers gently along the table. He had heard what was said, but more importantly, he had heard what was not. And somewhere between Marjorie's silence, Altamont's bitterness, and Lawrence's impatience, there was a melody forming. Not a confession, a composition. Chapter 6. A Guilt Too Neat. The morning shadows had begun to shorten when Inspector Graves returned to Windermere Hall. He came armed with what he clearly believed was a breakthrough. His heavy footsteps echoed through the corridor as he entered the morning room, where Poirot was still seated, notebook closed, fingertips resting together as if in prayer. Well, Monsieur Poirot, Graves said, the corners of his mouth tilting upward in quiet satisfaction. We may have a short case after all. The constables searched Marjorie Whitcomb's room this morning, found something of interest tucked into the lining of her valise. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Indeed. Graves pulled a small cloth bundle from his coat pocket and opened it. Inside lay a silver penknife, small, finely wrought, with a mother-of-pearl handle and a faint reddish stain along the base of the blade. Poirot's gaze narrowed. "And you believe this is the weapon?" "Matches the size and angle of the wound. And more importantly," Graves removed a folded paper from another pocket. This was also in her belongings. A page torn from her personal journal, half of a poem, unfinished. But the lines bear more than a passing resemblance to the one left with Trentham's body. Poirot took the paper delicately. The handwriting, the structure, it was emotional, vivid, but lacked the ruthless composure of the murder poem. Still, it used similar metaphors: blood, ink, betrayal. And the cadence was unmistakably hers. "She claimed last night to be alone," Graves continued. "No witnesses, no alibi. And now this." He gestured at the knife. Motive, opportunity, and evidence. Poirot did not reply immediately. He read the half-poem again, then folded the paper and returned it to the cloth. "Have you spoken with her?" "She's with my constable now, but she denies everything. Says she never saw the knife before." Poirot stood and walked to the window, peering out at the heavy mist still clinging to the garden. His silence stretched long enough for Graves to grow uncomfortable. "Come now," the inspector said. "Even you must admit this is compelling." "Oh, it is compelling, oui," Poirot said softly. "So compelling, in fact, that I find myself uneasy." Graves frowned. "Uneasy?" Poirot turned. "It is all too neat, too correct. The weapon perfectly placed. The poetic scrap conveniently left for discovery. The very suspect who inspired the poem's style is now presented as the one who penned its murder. A tidy package, nah?" Graves folded his arms. "You think she's been framed?" Poirot gave a slight shrug. "I think it is possible. Or, at the very least, that we are being invited to a conclusion." The inspector looked unconvinced. "She had every reason to hate him. You heard what she said. He stole her words, belittled her in public. She was infatuated, rejected, humiliated." "She cracked." "Perhaps," Poirot murmured. "But let us suppose this, mon ami. If she were truly the murderer, would she leave a poem that mimicked her own work? A murder written in her native tongue? Would she carry the weapon back to her room and hide it so shallowly it could be found by a constable with a pair of gloves and 5 minutes?" Graves sighed and rubbed his forehead. "Then what do you suggest?" Poirot moved toward the table and gently tapped the folded knife. "I suggest we speak with her, together, but not to trap her, to listen." They made their way to the small room where Marjorie sat, pale and shaking. Her eyes were rimmed with disbelief, and when the knife was presented to her, she looked not guilty, but terrified. "I swear," she said hoarsely, "I've never seen that knife before in my life." "And the paper?" Graves asked, his tone sharp but not cruel. "This page, from your journal." Marjorie swallowed. "Yes, that's mine, but it's from months ago. It was a draft of something personal. I don't even remember what it was about. Hugo never saw it." Poirot stepped forward. "Mademoiselle, if someone wished to cast suspicion on you, it would be easy to take something from your bag, from your desk. Do you recall anyone entering your room yesterday or this morning?" She shook her head. "No, but I left my door unlocked last night when I went to the bathroom. I didn't think anything of it." Poirot looked at her carefully. "You are a woman who writes, yes? You understand structure, pattern, emotion. The poem left with Hugo. Do you recognize its tone?" She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "It feels rehearsed, like a mask. There's no vulnerability in it. It's not honest. It reads like someone mimicking anger, not feeling it." Poirot smiled faintly. "Merci. That is what I thought too." After she was released back to her room, pending further investigation, Poirot and Graves returned to the drawing room. The inspector looked troubled now. "So, if not her," Poirot tapped his chin, "we must ask, who benefits from her fall? Who knew of her private writings? Who had access to her room, her belongings?" Graves thought for a moment. "Any of them could. The staff don't lock the rooms. Guests pass freely between wings during the day." "Then we are not looking for access, but knowledge," Poirot said. "Someone who knew just enough about Marjorie's feelings, her relationship with Hugo, to craft a believable deception. Someone who understood both the narrative and the rhythm." Graves frowned. "You're still thinking literary." "Always, mon ami. This killer composes, each act like a chapter, oui? And this was the chapter meant to distract us. But even the best writer leaves fingerprints, even in fiction." That afternoon, Poirot wandered through the house again, alone this time, quiet as a thought. He passed by the library, paused near the fireplace where Hugo had fallen. Then he moved upstairs, pausing at the hallway junction between the guest rooms. Here, he found a faint mark, just a scuff on the skirting board near Marjorie's door. Faint, but fresh. He knelt, examining it. Polished leather, male size. Not unusual in a house like this. But the angle, it suggested someone had paused here, waited, pressed against the wall. Poirot stood slowly and gazed down the corridor. A false lead, yes, but even misdirection contains truth. Because someone in this house did not merely want Hugo Trentham dead. They wanted to author his death. And Marjorie Whitcomb had simply been the next sentence. Chapter 7. A Game of Echoes. By late afternoon, the halls of Windermere Hall had sunk into a hush, so complete it felt curated, like the silence of a library before a revelation, or a theater as the curtain rises. Poirot walked the corridors with a kind of rhythmic calm, taking note not only of people, but of how they moved, their hesitation before turning a corner, their choice of where to sit, the glances exchanged without speech. He had decided. It was time to push, not accuse, not corner, but tilt the structure ever so slightly and watch which walls began to crack. He began with Celestine Vale. She was in the conservatory, barefoot on the cold tiles, cigarette in one hand and a volume of Baudelaire in the other. The glass walls reflected her silhouette threefold, like a ghost watching itself disappear. When she saw Poirot approach, she didn't flinch. She merely closed the book and dropped the cigarette into a nearby plant. "You come with the scent of judgment, Monsieur Poirot," she said. "How thrilling." Poirot gave a polite bow. "I come only to observe, mademoiselle, though I confess you are most fascinating to observe." She arched an eyebrow, amused. "Do go on. Writers are very much like murderers. No, both must understand motive. Both must craft illusion. And both know that the most dangerous truths are buried in the tone, not the content." "Poetic," she said with a soft smile. "Are you suggesting I murdered Hugo because I understand metaphor?" "No," Poirot replied. "I am suggesting that someone in this house used your voice to write a death." That made her freeze, only for a moment. Her eyes narrowed, glittering. "They forged me," she said slowly. "They imitated you," Poirot said. "And what intrigues me, mademoiselle, is that you have not denied authorship nearly as passionately as you could have." She smirked. "Let's be honest, Monsieur Poirot, I wanted him dead. I wanted him ruined. I dreamt of seeing his legacy collapse under the weight of his arrogance. But dream and deed are distant cousins." Poirot inclined his head. "Tell me, who, in your opinion, could mimic your work, with enough knowledge of your rhythm, your syntax, to pass off murder as art?" She turned, walking slowly to the edge of the glass. "Altamont, perhaps. He once reviewed my work line by line, publicly dissected it, as if he were sharpening his scalpel. Or Lawrence. He pretends to be above literature, but I've seen him study my notebooks out of sheer resentment. Jealousy is an exquisite tutor." "And Miss Whitcomb?" Celestine's expression hardened. "Marjorie's clever, but she lacks venom. And courage. She writes like someone afraid to offend the page." Poirot stepped closer. "But she loved Hugo." Celestine shrugged. So she thought. Until he turned the page on her. Poirot considered her words, then smiled softly. "Mademoiselle, what do you suppose is the most dangerous trait in a killer?" She tapped one nail against the glass. "Elegance. The ones who kill beautifully, you never see coming." Poirot nodded once, bowed, and left her with the cold creeping in at her feet. He moved next to Lawrence Darnley. The air was brooding in the billiards room. Swirling a glass of brandy he had yet to drink, he stood by the fire, staring into it as though trying to read something in the flames. He looked up as Poirot entered, the flicker of annoyance barely suppressed. "I've already said everything I have to say," he muttered. "Oui," Poirot replied calmly, "and yet I believe there are things you have not said, not because they are untrue, but because they are inconvenient." Lawrence's jaw tensed. "If you have something to accuse me of, say it." Poirot didn't move. "Tell me, monsieur, do you write poetry?" The question caught Lawrence off guard. His laugh was short, derisive. "God, no. Not even as a boy, a line here or there, something scribbled and forgotten." He frowned, then looked away. "I might have. Schoolboy rubbish." "Why?" Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Because the killer writes like someone with a buried fluency, not a professional, not a poet, but someone who studied them, who resents them." Lawrence didn't respond. Poirot took a step closer. "Do you recall threatening Hugo the night before his death?" Lawrence turned back, voice sharp. "I didn't threaten him. I told him to get out, to stop leeching off my family. That's not a threat, it's a fact. But you were angry." "I'm always angry," Lawrence snapped. "He deserved worse than he got. But I didn't kill him." Poirot waited, then asked, "Do you know what it means to frame a murder as art?" Lawrence blinked. "Is that what this is?" "Oui, a performance." "And a performance must always be for someone." Lawrence stared, but said nothing. Poirot left him there, still unspeaking, the brandy untouched in his hand. The third and final visit was to Dr. Felix Altamont, who was pacing the garden path under a wool coat, red scarf tucked against the wind. He looked up as Poirot joined him, but did not stop walking. "I assume you're here to prod again," he said dryly. "Only gently, monsieur." Altamont paused near a hedge. "I heard you found the knife, that the girl's been all but exonerated. Good. She's too meek to have pulled it off. No flair. Do you admire flair, Dr. Altamont? In murder? Absolutely not." He lit a cigarette. "But I understand it. This was a message, crafted. Not a loss of temper. A gesture. And who in this house do you believe would kill with such precision?" Altamont hesitated. Celestine is capable of it without question. But she's not the sort to plan. She reacts. Lawrence has motive, but lacks the subtlety. Eugenia, too proper, which leaves no one obvious. Poirot stepped beside him. And you, monsieur, you've written critiques that wound more deeply than any knife. You understand the power of a word left out. Altamont smiled. If I were the murderer, Poirot, I'd have made the poem more elegant. A couplet more, perhaps, a stanza to haunt. He blew smoke into the air, and I certainly wouldn't have used such a juvenile metaphor as borrowed bread. Poirot didn't smile. So you disapprove of the craftsmanship? I resent the mediocrity of it. They stood in silence for a moment before Altamont asked, "Tell me, Poirot, do you think it was personal?" Poirot's answer was soft. All murder is personal, even when it pretends not to be. That night, Poirot sat in the small writing room beside his own quarters. A single candle flickered on the desk, casting shadows across his notebook. He wrote not answers, but impressions. Each suspect now bore the mark of something hidden, a bruise beneath civility, a ripple beneath their calm. He had stirred the water, and something had begun to rise. They were cracking, slowly, but the cracks were not in their stories. They were in their reflections. Each of them had looked into the mirror of Hugo Trentham's death and seen something of themselves staring back. And for Poirot, that was the beginning of revelation. Chapter 8. The Letter That Vanished. The next morning arrived gray and disjointed, as though the sun itself had decided to abstain from Windermere Hall's affairs. A sharp wind swept across the lawns, rattling the old panes and sighing through the chimney flues like some ghost pressing its lips to the stone. Poirot sat quietly at the breakfast table, a single egg untouched before him, the toast cooling on its plate. His eyes, however, were bright, alert, though his body gave the appearance of leisurely calm. Every word spoken around the table, every utensil lifted, every sigh or silence was observed and filed away. He waited, and as often happened when Hercule Poirot waited, something came. It was the butler, Hammond, a thin man with a voice like creaking paper. He bent toward Poirot and murmured with discretion, "Lady Eugenia requests you in her study, sir. Urgently." Poirot dabbed his mouth with his napkin, rose, and followed with quiet purpose. Inside the study, Lady Eugenia stood by the writing desk, hands trembling, a slip of pale parchment clutched between her fingers. "This arrived this morning," she said without greeting, her voice barely above a whisper. "Left on my pillow." Poirot took the paper. The same parchment stock, the same curled lettering. A single verse, as before. "The widow keeps what silence buys, but letters burn where truth still lies. What's inked in night shall not remain. For words, once seen, are knives again." He read it twice, then looked up. "There was a letter, madame. Yes?" She nodded slowly, eyes glistening. "Yes. A letter Hugo gave me 2 days before his death. He claimed it was a confession of sorts, of his dealings, of what he had done with the estate's funds. He said it would make things clearer after the retreat. I was to keep it safe. I placed it in the top drawer of my desk. And now? Gone." She gestured helplessly. "Taken some time in the night." Poirot said nothing for a long moment. He walked to the desk, opened the drawer. It was empty, but bore no signs of disturbance. The lock unbroken, the contents, save for the letter, untouched. "This theft," he murmured, "it was not hasty. It was targeted, surgical." He turned back to Lady Eugenia. And who knew of the letter? No one, she insisted. Then after a pause, only Hugo. And I suppose, if I had to guess, Marjorie may have seen him give it to me. She was in the hallway. Poirot placed the threatening poem beside the other two. 3 now, each with its rhyme, its veiled menace, its performance. The killer wasn't simply covering tracks. They were curating a narrative. He left Lady Eugenia to recover, and made his way quickly to the library, where Marjorie was reviewing a stack of documents under the guise of continued retreat business. She looked up sharply when Poirot entered. "There's been another poem," he said, skipping preamble. "And a letter has gone missing. A very important one." She stood pale again. "A letter. From Hugo. You saw him give it to Lady Eugenia, did you not?" Yes, I didn't mean to eavesdrop. I was shelving some books in the corridor. I heard her ask him what he wanted in return. He laughed. Said only that the story deserves a proper ending. Then he handed her an envelope. Poirot paced slowly before her. "And did anyone else pass through the hall at that time?" Marjorie hesitated. "Yes. Celestine. She came down from the guest wing carrying her coat. Said she was going to the gardens. She brushed right past Hugo. He said something to her I couldn't hear. But she stopped, turned back and said, 'Don't flatter yourself, I've already killed you once.'" Poirot stopped. "Pardon?" Marjorie nodded. "That's what she said. I thought it was one of her melodramatic quips. But now it feels like foreshadowing," Poirot murmured. Marjorie sat down heavily. "Do you think she took the letter?" Poirot didn't answer. Instead, he went in search of Celestine. He found her in the music room, at the grand piano. Her fingers were tracing the keys idly, without sound. When he entered, she turned to him, expression unreadable. "You heard about the missing letter," she said before he could speak. "Eugenia's in quite the state." "You seem unsurprised." "Because I expected it." She stood and walked toward him. Hugo never gave without playing a deeper game. If he wrote something dangerous, someone would make sure it vanished. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back. "Did he show it to you?" Celestine laughed. "Me? No, he wouldn't give me the satisfaction. But he wanted me to know. He hinted at it the last night we spoke. Said, 'Your revenge will arrive sealed.'" Poirot tilted his head. "And did you respond?" She looked him dead in the eye. "I told him I hoped the seal would bleed when broken." He studied her in silence for a moment, then said, "Mademoiselle, did you take it?" Her lips curled. "No, but I wish I had." Poirot gave a small bow and left. That afternoon, Inspector Graves returned again, his arms full of updates, and none of them promising. "No signs of forced entry in any room," he said as they stood in the parlor. "The staff didn't see a thing. The guests were mostly in their rooms or wandering." "Then we assume," Poirot replied softly, "that this was not an act of opportunity. This was premeditated. The killer feared what that letter contained. And now it's gone," Graves said grimly. "Non, mon ami, it is not gone. It is hidden. Somewhere in this house." Poirot's eyes narrowed, because a murderer who writes in verse does not burn the truth. They preserve it. They place it, as they do everything, exactly where it must be found, at the perfect moment. Graves looked skeptical. "So, what do we do now?" "We wait," Poirot said, "and we listen, not for confession, but contradiction." Graves folded his arms. "You think someone will slip?" Poirot's voice was low. "They already have, but not in words." He turned to the window again, watching the wind chase leaves across the gravel path. Someone had taken the letter. Someone who had already killed once, and would do so again if it meant keeping control of the narrative. But Hercule Poirot had begun, at last, to hear the rhythm beneath the lies. Not a confession, not yet, but the structure of guilt. And that, for Poirot, was always where the truth began. Chapter 10. The Clue That Refused to Whisper. It was nearly midnight when Hercule Poirot returned to his modest guest room beneath the eaves of Windermere Hall. The rain had begun again, soft, rhythmic, like the ticking of an ancient clock trying to remember a forgotten time. Wind pressed against the windows, rattling the glass in fits, but inside, Poirot was composed, focused. His candle flickered, casting shifting gold across the folded letter before him, the letter Hugo Trentham had tried to conceal, then chose to reveal, and which someone had tried to erase from the tale entirely. But stories, Poirot thought, were stubborn things, and this story had not yet finished telling itself. He read the letter again, not for content but for cadence, for the voice within it. Hugo's voice was unmistakable, blunt, arrogant, transactional. His sentences cut like a ledger, short, factual, efficient. But there, tucked at the very end, beneath the list of literary thefts and financial schemes, was a postscript. One Poirot had overlooked in the first reading. "Tell her I meant to give them back. The lines, the fire. I kept them because I loved them, and I loved them because I could never write them myself. Her verses haunted me. I wore them like a mask, but I knew one day she would find me behind it." There it was, the slippage, not the confession of a man protecting himself, but the guilt of a man who knew the mask was fraying. Poirot folded the letter carefully and placed it inside a fresh envelope. Not for the police, not yet. It would serve better in performance. And then, his mind returning to something barely noticed, he rose. He walked to the dresser where earlier he had placed the copy of Collected Modern Poets, Volume 4, the same volume that had concealed the letter. But it wasn't the book itself that interested him now. It was the inside cover. Poirot opened it again. He had glanced at it once, but now, with clarity forming in his mind, he examined it with purpose. Stamped on the inside cover was a faint bookplate. Ex Libris, C.V., Celestine Vale. The book was hers. She had placed it there. She had hidden the letter. And she had made sure it would be found later, at the correct dramatic moment. Poirot closed the book slowly and sat once more. His thoughts moved like the gears of a fine Swiss clock, precise, unhurried, inevitable. Celestine had motive, rage, a history of betrayal. But she also had something rarer, control. She had the literary intelligence to craft not only a poem, but a murder that mimicked it. And she had the theatrical sense to write her vengeance into each act of the crime. And yet, Poirot's fingers rested on the edge of his candle's holder. Something still flickered. She had hidden the letter. Yes, but not burned it, not destroyed it. Why? Why leave it in her own book, where discovery would inevitably point back to her? Unless, Poirot's brow furrowed, unless she wanted to frame herself, temporarily. No killer wants to be caught, but a writer might wish to be suspected, if only long enough to enjoy the suspense, the danger, the power of proximity. The murder was a narrative. But Celestine, he now suspected, was not the author. She was the editor. Somewhere in the footnotes of this tale, someone else had written the truth. And Poirot's eyes, finally found the line he had overlooked before. The next morning, Windermere Hall woke to a tense, strange calm. The rain had stopped, the clouds had fractured, but within the walls a storm had only begun to form. Poirot walked the corridors with purpose. He paused near the butler's alcove, where Hammond was preparing tea for the household. Poirot nodded politely, then gestured to the servant's logbook, open beside the silver tray. "May I?" Poirot asked. Hammond hesitated, then stepped aside. Poirot ran his finger down the column of comings and goings, looking for a particular name. There it was. Dr. Felix Altamont, entry to East Study, 2340, 2 nights prior, just after the murder. Poirot's lips pressed together. That room was directly beneath Lady Eugenia's study, and in the floor plan of Windermere Hall, shared years ago in a journal article about its architecture, there was a service grate in that room, a small, decorative vent that led directly to the study's fireplace flue, enough to hear a conversation, or a confession. Poirot thanked Hammond and turned. Later that morning, Poirot summoned all of them to the drawing-room. Inspector Graves stood by the hearth, arms crossed. Marjorie sat stiffly on the edge of the settee. Lady Eugenia clutched her shawl tighter with each breath. Celestine lounged against the grand piano, arms folded, her eyes fixed on Poirot with a mix of amusement and apprehension. Lawrence stood apart, hands in pockets, jaw clenched. Dr. Altamont leaned against the bookshelf, seemingly indifferent, but Poirot noted the way his foot tapped ever so slightly. "I have," Poirot began softly, "something I would like to return to the group." He drew from his coat a folded sheet. "The missing letter." Gasps, a few startled glances. Graves straightened. "I found it not in the study, not in the fire, but in a book of poems shelved in the library, a volume owned by one of you." Poirot turned, looking at Celestine. "Yours, mademoiselle." Her lips parted, just slightly, but she said nothing. "You hid it," Poirot continued, "but not to erase Hugo's crimes. You wished for it to be found at the right moment. You wanted his sins known, but you did not kill him." Lawrence stepped forward. "Wait. Then who?" Poirot turned slowly to face the final figure, Dr. Altamont. The room went still. The critic gave a short, bitter laugh. "Do explain, Monsieur Poirot." "With pleasure," Poirot said. "You were once Hugo's friend, his partner, but he betrayed you, not with money, but with authorship. He published essays you had ghostwritten. You let it go, for years. But when he began again, stealing Celestine's work, Marjorie's edits, repackaging them, you saw your chance." Poirot stepped closer. "You had the literary skill to write in Celestine's voice, to compose a murder scene that mirrored her style, and you had access to the household. You knew Marjorie's handwriting. You planted her poem and the knife. But you did not intend to destroy her. You intended only to create doubt." Altamont's smile faltered. "And the letter?" "You overheard Hugo giving it to Lady Eugenia, through the study flue. You retrieved it later, and placed it not to protect yourself, but to frame Celestine next. To shift suspicion, one act at a time." Poirot held up the letter again. "But you left your clue. The postscript. Hugo's confession of admiration. That wasn't written in the same hand. It was an addition, your addition. The ink is newer, the rhythm stilted, and it contains a metaphor Hugo never used." Poirot's voice lowered. "She would find me behind the mask." A critic's phrase. Not a publisher's, not a thief's, but a rival's. Altamont said nothing, Only the wind responded, rattling the glass. Poirot turned to Graves. The killer, he said, wrote murder as commentary. He killed not to silence, but to revise, to reshape a legacy. And now, the story, Poirot said, is nearly over. Chapter 11. The Unraveling Thread. The room had frozen into tableau. Dr. Felix Altamont, once composed in his elegant indifference, now stood as though the floor beneath him had fractured. His eyes flicked not to Poirot nor Inspector Graves, but to the rest of the room, the witnesses, the audience, as though searching for a single sympathetic gaze. None came. Celestine's expression was unreadable, though her fingers tightened slightly on the piano's edge. Marjorie stared at the carpet, pale. Lady Eugenia looked stunned, her mouth half parted, the letter still folded in Poirot's hand like a verdict waiting to be read aloud. Lawrence exhaled once, sharply, then muttered, "I knew it." "I must protest," Altamont said suddenly, his voice tightening. "Your theory, interesting though it may be, is circumstantial at best. A critic of literature is hardly a forger of crime. You're building castles on sand, Poirot. I am not building," Poirot said quietly. "I am revealing. The structure already exists. You laid the foundation years ago, when you first allowed your name to be eclipsed by Hugo Trentham's. You tolerated his theft. But when he began again, when he stole her voice—" Poirot nodded toward Celestine. "You recognized your own humiliation in hers. You could not forgive him a second time." Altamont laughed again, but it was thinner now, barbed with something raw. "You give me too much credit. I disliked the man, yes. But murder, that's rather dramatic, even for me. And yet," Poirot said, "drama is your métier, is it not? You, of all people, would understand the power of suggestion, the elegance of misdirection. You wrote the murder like a critic pens a scathing review, sharp, masked in literary civility, but intended to wound." Altamont stepped away from the bookshelf. "You have no proof." "I have pattern," Poirot said, "and I have motive, timing, and fabrication." Graves stepped forward now, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "Enough to detain and question formally, Dr. Altamont." Altamont's mouth opened, then closed. "You'll regret this." "I doubt it," Poirot murmured. But the moment did not settle. It twisted. Because before Graves could produce handcuffs or summon the constables, another voice spoke up. "You're wrong." All heads turned. The voice was quiet, but clear. It belonged to Marjorie. She stood now, shaking slightly, her eyes rimmed with something between fury and shame. It wasn't him. Poirot did not move. "No." She shook her head. "He didn't kill Hugo. I did." A stunned silence gripped the room like frost. Graves blinked. "You what?" "I killed him," Marjorie said again, louder. "I went to his room that night. I had the knife with me. I found the poem in his drawer. He wrote it, not me. He wrote it as a joke, a cruel little flourish for the end of the retreat. It was meant to be read at the final dinner, a parody of Celestine's style, a dig at me. He'd been collecting pieces of my writing for months, plagiarizing them, turning them into mockery." She looked down at her hands. "When I saw it, something in me broke. I confronted him. He laughed, said I should be flattered. I didn't plan it, but I saw the knife on his desk, a letter opener, and her voice cracked. I stabbed him." "No," Poirot said quietly. Marjorie faltered. "What?" "You did not kill Hugo Trentham." She blinked at him. "But I just said—" "You confessed to a crime," Poirot said softly, "that you believe you committed, but the facts say otherwise. You did not have access to the knife. The blood patterns show no struggle, no hesitation. The scene was composed after death. By someone who wanted it to look poetic. Poirot stepped closer. You may have confronted him. You may have found that poem. But when you left, Hugo Trentham was still alive. He died later. And someone used your guilt to frame the scene. Marjorie staggered back as if struck. But how can you know? Poirot nodded toward Altamont. Because the man who truly killed him wanted to control every word. He would never allow a spontaneous act of rage to spoil his composition. Altamont said nothing. But his silence had shifted now. No longer denial, just waiting. Poirot turned once more to the room. This has been a game of reflection. Each suspect has seen something of themselves in the victim. Lady Eugenia, her trust betrayed. Lawrence, his legacy undermined. Celestine, her voice stolen. Marjorie, her loyalty twisted. But only one saw the death as a necessary editorial, a correction of narrative, a reclamation of voice. Poirot stepped to the center of the room. Altamont did not just kill Trentham. He rewrote him. He drafted a death. Then he placed the blame where it would feel most poetic, first on Marjorie, then Celestine. Each act a chapter in his critique. Graves looked at Altamont again. Anything to say? Altamont's smile was bitter, and now completely still. He was a parasite. He fed on better minds. We all know it. I only made sure the world knew it too. Poirot's voice dropped. And did the world ask you to be its author? Altamont's expression hardened. No, but it needed one. Graves moved forward at last and placed a hand on the man's arm. There was no struggle. As he was led from the room, Altamont turned once to Celestine. You should thank me. I did what you couldn't. Celestine said nothing. She didn't even blink. Only when the doors closed behind him did anyone exhale. Lawrence sank into a chair, rubbing his face. Good God. A killer in verse. Poirot gave a small shrug. He killed with a red pen. But murder is murder, whether written or screamed. Lady Eugenia rose quietly and left the room, her shawl trailing behind her like a ghost shedding its form. Marjorie sat down, shaking, then buried her face in her hands. Poirot remained standing alone at the center, unmoving. There was still something unspoken in the air, a line yet to be written. But the page, at last, had begun to turn. Chapter 12. The Turning of the Blade. It was just past 3 in the afternoon, when a heavy quiet fell upon Windermere Hall, the kind of silence left in the wake of confession. The drawing-room still bore the scent of candle wax and damp wool from Altamont's arrest, and the furniture remained slightly askew, as if the house itself had shifted under the weight of truth. Poirot stood alone in the corridor outside, unmoving, gazing through the high-arched window at the half-dead rose vines twisting up the stone. His hands were folded neatly behind his back, but his thoughts were swift, tangled, relentless. The arrest had been orderly, the motive profound, and yet something in the air was wrong, not incorrect, but incomplete. Too many pieces still clicked too easily into place. Too many reactions lacked true surprise. Celestine Vale had not flinched, not even once. Poirot turned. He made his way down the passage with quiet purpose, shoes whispering against the rug. He passed portraits of solemn-eyed Darnley ancestors, and a grandfather clock ticking in time with something colder than patience. He did not knock when he reached her door. He simply opened it. Celestine was waiting. She stood by the window, gloved hands folded in front of her, dressed not in black, but in a deep burgundy velvet gown, as though she had chosen the shade not for mourning, but for theater. "You came," she said. Not as a question. Poirot inclined his head. "Of course. I always come when the script is unfinished." She turned, eyes calm and terribly steady. "You've made your arrest. Why return to the stage?" Poirot stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "Because I believe the curtain has not yet fallen, and I do not trust endings that come too easily." Celestine smiled faintly. "You doubt your own deduction?" "No. But I believe your performance is too careful." He stepped closer. "When Altamont was accused, you did not react. Not in grief, not in relief. You expected it. You permitted it." She said nothing. Poirot continued softly. "The letter was placed in your book, not by accident, not because you were careless, but because you intended it to be found, after suspicion had shifted away from you. You calculated every scene." She tilted her head. "And yet, you chose Altamont." Poirot nodded. "Because he played the part. He saw himself as avenger, literary executioner. And he did alter the scene. He added the poem's final touches, staged the body, perhaps even planted Marjorie's draft. But the fatal blow—" Poirot paused, voice dropping to a hush. "It was not his hand that held the knife?" A long silence passed between them. Then she spoke. "Do you want me to deny it?" "No," Poirot said. "I want you to understand why you did it." Celestine walked slowly to the armchair and sat, her movements graceful and slow, as if she were descending into memory. "He stole from me," she said simply. "Not just words, rhythm, the temper of my voice. He diluted me, poured my spirit into lesser mouths, then laughed when I protested, called it flattery, said the audience couldn't tell the difference." She looked up, and perhaps they couldn't, but I could, and so could he. Poirot nodded. He was a man of clever theft, not crude. He left enough of your voice to haunt you, but not enough to credit. "Yes," she whispered. "And when I discovered the full extent of it, how many poems, how many lines, I waited. I listened. And when he gave Lady Eugenia that letter, I knew it would all come out, but not the way I needed." "You needed the world to see him burn," Poirot said softly. "Not just fall." She nodded once. "I wanted him dismantled, publicly, permanently, with art." Poirot paced, not in anger but in understanding. "So you confronted him." "That night," she said, "after Marjorie left. He was still smug, still mocking. I told him I knew. He smiled, and said, 'Then write me a good death, darling.'" She closed her eyes. "So I did." Poirot folded his arms. "And Altamont?" "I told him the next morning. He guessed part of it. I let him think he knew more than he did. He added the final touches, moved the body, planted the poem. He thought he was delivering poetic justice. But you were the author. Always," she said, eyes steady again. "From the first line." Poirot said nothing for a moment. Then, "You killed him not in hatred, but in craft." "I killed him," she corrected, "in context." Poirot's voice was gentler now. "But murder is not publication, mademoiselle. It does not end when the reader applauds." Celestine stood, then let the critics come. He took one step closer. "There is still a choice, you know. To surrender not to justice, but to honesty. Tell the truth, Celestine, fully, before someone else does it for you." She looked at him. "You won't tell them?" "I will, but I would prefer the final stanza come from your voice." A long pause. And then, quietly, beautifully, she said, "I killed a man who murdered with a fountain pen. I did it with a real blade. One is printed, one is punished. The difference is only ink." Poirot inclined his head. "And that is your epilogue." He turned and left her there. The velvet gown pooled at her feet like spilled ink. Behind him, Windermere Hall sighed beneath the weight of silence once more. But the tale was nearly done, and the truth, though buried beneath layers of language and pain, had spoken at last. Chapter 13. A desperate attempt to escape night settled over Windermere Hall like a velvet curtain, heavy and concealing. The lanterns in the hallway flickered under the breath of the storm, returning from the west, and the house groaned beneath the weight of its own secrets. Yet, in the private recesses of Hercule Poirot's mind, the mystery no longer stirred. It merely waited, like a clock striking the final chime. He had heard what he needed. He had seen every gesture, every note of self-deception dressed as pride. Celestine's confession, unrecorded, unchallenged, remained in his mind like the final line of a tragic poem. It was a confession of rhythm, of calculated fury. But something still lingered, something unresolved, and it came, like all final acts of desperation, not from Celestine, but from the woman least expected. At 10:30, Poirot sat by the fire in the small lounge adjoining his quarters, sipping weak tea and reviewing his notes. A knock interrupted the hush. It was the butler, Hammond, visibly disturbed. "Sir," he murmured. "Miss Whitcomb. She's gone." Poirot stood immediately. Gone? She asked to step outside, to the garden, said the air would do her good. I gave her my umbrella. That was an hour ago. She's not returned. One of the maids found the garden gate open. Poirot moved with a sudden urgency. "Tell Inspector Graves. Wake the staff, and find Lady Eugenia. This ends tonight." He stepped out into the corridor, the echo of his polished shoes brisk against the marble. The house had grown uneasy, lamplight dimmed, shutters trembling. He passed Marjorie's room, unlocked, abandoned. Her bag was gone. Her journal drawer left open, the pages torn, and one page, crumpled in haste, remained on the floor. A note, written in her hand, hurriedly, without the usual precision. "I didn't kill him, but I might as well have. I should have told the truth when I had the chance. I should have burned the poems. He didn't deserve my loyalty, but I gave it anyway. And now, there's nothing left for me here. No voice, no name, only silence. Forgive me for wanting to escape it." Poirot folded the paper gently, lips pressed tight. He moved swiftly, down the staircase, out into the night. The wind hit his face like a warning. Trees bent in shadow, leaves whipped around him like ash. He passed the hedges, the rose bushes, the path leading to the lake. And there, just beyond the last bend, he saw her. Marjorie stood at the edge of the water. Her figure cloaked in the storm-dark coat of Hammond's livery, her hair tangled, her shoes sinking slowly into the mud. Poirot approached with care, his voice soft but clear. "Mademoiselle." She turned, startled. Her eyes were red, swollen, not from tears, but from exhaustion. "I'm not going to jump," she said quietly, though I thought about it. Poirot took another step. "Then why run?" She looked at the water, then back at him. "Because I didn't kill him. But I feel like I did. I saw the worst in him, and I stayed. I helped him with those articles, those contracts. I cleaned his messes. I protected him even after I knew what he was." Poirot nodded. "You were loyal to the man you hoped he would become." "And then I saw what he wrote," she whispered. "That poem. The words he stole from me, reshaped into cruelty. It wasn't just my work. It was my pain. He turned it into a joke." Poirot moved beside her now, close enough to see her breath in the cold air. You confronted him that night, didn't you? She nodded. I threw the poem in his face. I told him he was a fraud. He laughed, said I should be proud, a muse with punctuation skills. I left shaking. I slammed his door. And when I looked back, he was still smirking. Poirot let the silence settle. And then I went to my room. I didn't sleep. I wrote a letter I never sent. And then this morning, I saw what happened. What Celestine had done. What Altamont had tried to finish. And I realized, if you hadn't stepped in, I'd have been buried in the margins. She took a breath. I just wanted to disappear. I didn't want to be another suspect, another footnote in someone else's narrative. Poirot placed a hand gently on her shoulder. But you are not a suspect. You are a survivor. And now, mademoiselle, you have the chance to be something greater still, a witness. Her eyes widened slightly. You mean testify? Poirot nodded. Celestine's words were eloquent, but they were spoken in private. Justice must be served by truth, not beauty, and only your account can complete the story. She stared out at the water for a long moment. Then she whispered, I'll speak. Poirot offered her his arm. She took it. Slowly, they began walking back toward the house. As they approached the threshold, the lanterns glimmered brighter, casting long shadows behind them. Inside, Inspector Graves was waiting. He stepped forward, eyes sharp, but his voice calm. We searched the perimeter. No sign of anyone else. And you? Poirot offered a faint smile. I found a soul on the edge of silence, and returned her to the story. Marjorie stood straighter now. I'll tell you everything. Poirot turned once more to the storm outside. The wind had softened, the sky beginning to clear. But he knew. One last truth remained hidden, its shape just visible beneath the surface. And tomorrow, when the house gathered for the final reckoning, the story would be written in full. No more red ink. Only clarity. Chapter 14. The final piece falls into place. Morning arrived at Windermere Hall under a weak, watery sun, bleeding pale light across the misty lawns. The storm had passed, but its remnants clung to the windows, leaving trails of condensation like fading fingerprints on glass. The air had a stillness to it, the quiet that follows upheaval, where truths hang suspended, and all that remains is for someone to speak them aloud. In the dining room, breakfast was untouched. The table, usually alive with rustling napkins and murmured courtesies, sat in sullen silence. Lady Eugenia nursed a cup of cold tea. Lawrence leaned against the far wall, his tie loosened, eyes sunken. Marjorie sat rigidly beside the window, clutching a notepad in her lap. She had not fled again. She had not denied what she saw. But her silence now had the gravity of someone preparing to say something final. Poirot stood near the hearth, unhurried as ever, but alert, sharp as a knife held just behind the curtain. Inspector Graves paced at the doorway, arms folded, his expression unreadable. And when Celestine Vale finally entered, elegant, poised, a trace of scarlet lipstick perfectly applied, it was as if the final actor had taken the stage. I was told we're to hear the truth, she said, sweeping her eyes across the room. Isn't that what we all wanted? Her voice was calm. But beneath the poise, Poirot saw it. The control, now held tightly by a fraying thread. He stepped forward. Yes, mademoiselle. The truth, but not just yours. This morning, I pieced together the final contradiction. A single detail, buried in your own words. Celestine arched a brow. How dramatic. Poirot gestured gently to Marjorie. You said Hugo laughed when you confronted him. that he told you to be flattered. You left him alive. Marjorie nodded slowly. Yes. And Dr. Altamont, when questioned, claimed he altered the scene. Planted the poem, arranged the desk, but he made one mistake. Poirot turned. He did not write the original poem. He merely staged it. The language was too refined for him, the metaphor too specific, which leaves only one hand that could have written it. He turned to Celestine. Yours. Celestine's smile was faint, a fact you've already suggested. But what I had not realized, Poirot continued, was when you wrote it. The room fell still. Poirot's voice lowered, measured, and exact. You did not write that poem after Hugo's death, mademoiselle. You wrote it before, the night prior, in your journal, not as confession, but as temptation. You showed it to Hugo, dangled it in front of him, knowing he could not resist claiming it. Celestine said nothing. You planted it not to mislead the investigation, but to provoke his theft. He took it, retyped it, altered one line, and placed it in his desk, intending to read it aloud and mock you at the final dinner. Poirot's eyes narrowed. But that was your trap. You wanted him to steal it, because you knew, if he did, it would justify what came next. Not just to the world, but to yourself. You set the stage. You baited the scene. And when you returned to his room that night, after Marjorie left and saw your poem in his drawer, your plan became action. Celestine's hands, poised on the back of a chair, had gone very still. You stabbed him in silence, Poirot said. A single thrust, clean, controlled. You did not scream, you did not hesitate, because you had rehearsed it. The death was the final stanza of a poem he didn't even know he'd begun. Celestine's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Poirot continued, his voice gentler now, and when it was done, you stepped back. You let Altamont believe he had shaped the scene. You let Marjorie suffer the guilt. You even allowed me to arrest a man who believed he was complicit, because he was in a lesser way. But the hand that killed him, the mind that orchestrated it, the voice that wrote the first line, was yours. A long silence. Then Celestine exhaled slowly. I never wanted the world to see him fall, she said softly. I wanted them to see me rise. And he was in the way. Poirot nodded. And so you gave him a poet's death. She turned her gaze toward the window. He told me once that the greatest cruelty was to die unmourned. But I thought the greater cruelty was to be remembered as a fraud. Marjorie rose slowly from her chair. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but resolute. You used all of us. You twisted our wounds into your stage directions. Celestine turned to her, and yet none of you stopped him. For years. We were afraid, Marjorie whispered. You weren't. Poirot stepped forward now, placing a hand on the letter folded in his breast pocket. Hugo Trentham's final confession. It is over, he said softly. There will be no audience now. No editor to clean the ending. Only the truth. Celestine straightened her shoulders. Then let the truth walk with me. I've written enough endings for others. Inspector Graves moved forward, nodding once. We'll arrange for transport to the station, quietly. As he led her from the room, the others remained still. Lady Eugenia stood slowly, her voice brittle but strong. Burn his books and start again. Marjorie's eyes welled, but she said nothing. Lawrence muttered, "About time," and walked out. Poirot remained last. He walked to the hearth and adjusted a crooked picture on the mantel, an old engraving of Windermere Hall in better times. The image was faded now, just like the illusions that once lived within its walls. He picked up Hugo's poem from the desk, the one written in another's voice, read it again, then folded it. Without expression, and placed it into the flames. The fire did not resist. And at last, silence filled the room. But not the silence of fear, the silence of something ended. Chapter 15. The final gathering. By late afternoon, Windermere Hall had returned to an almost eerie calm. The halls were silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the drawing-room, each second now devoid of threat. A storm had passed, several, in fact, and the residue of truth clung to every polished surface and empty corridor like a mist refusing to lift. The arrest of Celestine Vale had not brought celebration. There was no gloating, no final applause, no dramatic scene fit for the stage she had imagined. Only the rustling of a coat as she quietly handed herself over, the whisper of boots on gravel as the inspector's car rolled down the drive, and the soft hush of rain against stone once more. Poirot stood near the window of the morning room, his silhouette small and neat against the last golden glow of the sun, as it filtered through the parted curtains. He did not speak for some time, even as Lady Eugenia joined him with slow, deliberate steps. "She looked so calm," Lady Eugenia said, almost to herself. "I don't understand it." As if she had done something noble. Poirot did not turn. To her, perhaps it was. There are those who believe that vengeance is justice in disguise. That beauty, when corrupted, demands retribution. The older woman pressed her lips together, staring toward the horizon. But what about Marjorie? About all the others she used like pawns? Poirot nodded slowly. "Ah, but pawns, madame, are not powerless. They may move but one square at a time, but they move forward, and that is often enough." She looked at him then, her eyes searching. "Did you always suspect her?" "No," he admitted. "At first, I suspected what she wanted me to suspect, that Hugo was a cruel manipulator, that others around him had cause for revenge, that art had been turned into violence, all of which was true, but not the truth." He stepped away from the window. The truth, madame, was far more quiet. A woman slighted, a voice stolen, a life edited by someone who thought cruelty was a kind of brilliance. Celestine was not simply enacting murder, she was rewriting the ending. Lady Eugenia sighed, and her hands trembled slightly as she reached for a glass of sherry left untouched on a side table. "And now?" she asked. "What becomes of us all?" "That," Poirot said softly, "is precisely why I have asked everyone to gather." Half an hour later, the remaining guests and residents of Windermere Hall assembled in the library. The fire was lit, but no one sat too close. The room was quiet, as if unsure what tone it should hold, mourning or relief, regret or closure. Marjorie Whitcomb sat near the corner, her posture rigid, her eyes distant. The shadows beneath them had not lifted, but they no longer held fear. Lawrence Trentham stood with a drink in his hand, unshaven, his cravat askew. He looked less like the heir to a legacy, and more like a man confronting the weight of its ruins. Lady Eugenia occupied the high-backed chair beside the hearth, as she had so many times before, but this time she looked smaller somehow, as if the seat no longer belonged to her fully. Poirot entered last, carrying a thin file under one arm. He nodded respectfully to each of them, then took a position in the center of the room where he could be seen, but more importantly, heard. "I thank you for gathering," he began, his voice gentle but unwavering. "The matter of Hugo Trentham's death has reached its conclusion. The culprit, as you now know, was not a stranger to any of you. Mademoiselle Vale's confession is complete, and in due course the authorities will determine her fate." He paused, allowing the truth to settle once more. But this evening I do not speak of crime. I speak of consequence. A flicker of confusion crossed Lawrence's face. Poirot turned toward him. Monsieur Trentham, I have read the documents left behind in your brother's drawer, the contracts, the blackmail, the accounts linked to your inheritance. I believe the time has come for transparency. Lawrence bristled. If you're implying I was complicit, I imply nothing, Poirot said calmly. But I state this. Your brother left debts both financial and moral. And though his life has ended, his shadow remains. You have the choice now to bury it with him or to face it. Lawrence swallowed hard, looking away. Poirot turned to Lady Eugenia. You, madame, must decide whether Windermere Hall remains a fortress of silence or becomes something else, a place not of power but of truth. She gave no reply, but something flickered in her eyes. At last, Poirot approached Marjorie. She met his gaze without flinching. Miss Whitcomb, your words in the garden were brave, and your silence since has been heavier than any scream. You are not a victim of a crime, but of a life spent under the weight of another's name. He offered her the file. She took it. Inside were letters, copies of correspondence proving Hugo had stolen her work for years, passing her prose off as his own, altering it to fit his voice, silencing her when she dared to protest. You may do with them as you please, Poirot said. Publish, destroy, or simply keep them as record of what was stolen. Marjorie blinked quickly, then held the folder to her chest. Thank you, she whispered. Poirot turned now to the room at large. You all gathered here believing this weekend would celebrate a man's work. Instead, you were confronted with its cost. But if you leave here with anything, let it be this. Art is not the property of those with the loudest voice, and truth is not owned by those with the highest name. It is the quiet ones, the nearly forgotten, the nearly broken, who carry it. He looked around once more. And it is up to us to listen. No one moved. For a long moment the fire crackled and no words came. Then, softly, Lady Eugenia stood. I think, she said slowly, we will not host another festival next year. Lawrence said nothing, but he drained his glass. Marjorie looked to Poirot. Will you stay the night? Poirot smiled gently. No, mademoiselle. I believe the house belongs to you now, not in deed, but in spirit, and it will need no detective tomorrow. He gathered his coat and hat, nodded once more, and stepped out of the library. Outside, dusk had fallen. The lake shimmered faintly in the distance, reflecting what little light remained. And in the hush that followed, the house exhaled. Chapter 16. A Letter Never Sent. The quiet that had settled over Windermere Hall in the wake of the final gathering was fragile, like the delicate threads of a spider's web trembling in the softest breeze. Yet even as the guests dispersed to their rooms, and the last footsteps echoed faintly down the stone corridors, there remained in Poirot's mind the sense of an unfinished verse, something tucked between the lines, elusive yet persistent. He returned to his modest quarters late that evening, the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls. There, amidst his scattered notes and the fading scent of old paper, lay a small envelope he had not yet opened, a letter from Marjorie Whitcomb, left upon her departure. The parchment was folded carefully, sealed with a delicate press of wax, unmarked by any stamp or address. It bore only her unmistakable handwriting. With care, Poirot broke the seal. The letter was brief. Monsieur Poirot, thank you for giving me the courage to speak. There is one thing I could not say aloud, for fear it might unravel everything further. Hugo Trentham once showed me a letter he had received long before we met. It was unsigned, threatening, and spoke of a secret buried deep in the past, a secret that, if revealed, would destroy more than just a career. He called it the hidden verse. I never saw the letter. I do not know if it still exists, but I suspect someone here does. Perhaps it is why the poems, the letters, the accusations took such a calculated path. Not random chaos, but a story guided by the fear of that verse. If there is any chance to uncover it, know that I trust your little gray cells to find it. With gratitude, Marjorie Poirot folded the letter slowly and placed it in his breast pocket. He rose and looked once more toward the window. Outside, the moon hung low, a silver scythe slicing through the clouds. A secret buried long ago. A shadow lingering beneath the surface. The hidden verse. The following morning, Poirot gathered the household in the library once again. The tension was quieter now, less brittle, but with an undercurrent of unease. Every face was expectant, aware that one more revelation might topple the delicate balance restored only yesterday. Poirot spoke with measured calm. Mademoiselle Whitcomb's letter speaks of something that predates us all, an old secret hidden beneath the layers of this estate. Something more powerful than stolen poems or rivalries. He turned to Lady Eugenia. Madame, has anything from your family's past ever caused distress or scandal that was carefully concealed? Lady Eugenia's fingers trembled around her teacup. There was a letter, years ago, between my late husband and his brother. It spoke cryptically of a curse of the Darnley line, of debts not just financial but moral. But it was dismissed as old superstition. Poirot nodded slowly. The hidden verse then might be not a poem, but a legacy. He paced the room. I have asked Hammond to search the archives, private correspondence, journals, anything related to the Darnley brothers. Hours later, Hammond returned with a worn, leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked, the pages yellowed and brittle with age. Poirot opened it carefully. Inside were entries, personal reflections of the elder Darnley brother, Hugo's father. The handwriting was tight and elegant, betraying a mind burdened with secrets. One entry, dated nearly 50 years before, caught Poirot's eye. It spoke of a hidden pact, an agreement made between the brothers during a time of desperation, a secret kept to protect the family name, involving the silencing of a scandal that could have destroyed them all. And then, beneath that, a cryptic verse. The blood we shed in silence stains the roots beneath the Darnley veins. A verse untold. A debt unpaid, in shadows deep, our fates are laid. Poirot's eyes lingered on the words. The hidden verse was no mere poem. It was a binding oath, a curse, a concealed truth that had festered beneath the grandeur of Windermere Hall. He summoned Lawrence and Lady Eugenia to the library, presenting the journal. Lawrence frowned deeply as he read. I've heard whispers of this before. Family gossip passed down in hushed tones. But no one ever spoke openly. Lady Eugenia's voice was fragile. My father warned me to never seek what lies beneath, that some truths were better left buried. Poirot folded the journal gently. But the past does not always stay buried, madame. Sometimes it calls out through the voices of those who suffer beneath its shadow. He looked at Lawrence. Your family's debts extended beyond ledgers and investments. They reached into secrets, into lives altered and silenced. Lawrence's jaw clenched. If this is true, it changes everything. And it explains, Poirot added, why Hugo was desperate, why he gambled with your legacy and with the lives of those around him. He was trying to pay a debt centuries old. As the day waned, Poirot felt the weight of history pressing against the present, the intertwining of old sins and new tragedies forming a tapestry both tragic and inevitable. He returned once more to his room and lit his candle, placing the journal beside the letter from Marjorie. Two pieces of a puzzle, bound by ink and silence. In the stillness, Poirot's mind moved swiftly toward the final chapters of the tale, the reckoning that would expose not only a murderer, but the haunted lineage that had shaped the fateful weekend. Outside, the moon drifted behind a veil of clouds. The hidden verse was no longer hidden, and tomorrow the last lines would be read. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. The morning light filtered softly through the tall windows of Windermere Hall, casting long shadows over the worn carpets and dust-muted furnishings. The air was heavy, laden with the weight of revelations, confessions, and the quiet expectancy of final judgment. The household had gathered once more in the morning room, where the atmosphere was sober but tinged with a tentative relief. An end was near, but the cost was still palpable. Poirot stood at the center, calm and composed as always, but his eyes held the weight of all he had witnessed. Around him were the remaining figures: Lady Eugenia, her posture fragile but resolute; Lawrence, whose youthful defiance had softened into weary acceptance; Marjorie, pale yet strengthened by the courage to speak; and the ever-watchful Inspector Graves, whose presence underscored the gravity of what was to come. "We have traversed a path fraught with deception and pain," Poirot began, his voice steady and clear. "And now we stand at the precipice of justice, not merely as the application of law, but as the restoration of truth." He paused, letting the words settle. Celestine Vale's confession revealed the method and motive behind Hugo Trentham's death, a calculated act born of artistic fury and long-suppressed betrayal. Yet, as we uncovered, the roots of this tragedy reach far deeper, entwined with a legacy of secrets and silence that have shadowed this family for generations. Poirot's gaze swept the room, touching each face. The hidden verse, the binding oath concealed within the Darnley lineage, speaks of debts far beyond currency or titles. It is a curse of silence, a history of sacrifices made in the shadows to preserve a name. Hugo's desperate gambles, his thefts, and his ultimate fate were the final chapters of that silent narrative. Lawrence exhaled deeply, the burden of ancestral sin apparent. "I never knew. I never understood the cost." Lady Eugenia's voice broke gently. "And now the cost is clear. But what of those left to bear it?" Poirot nodded. "Justice, mademoiselle, is not only about punishment, it is about balance. It is about allowing the truth to heal wounds, and the guilty to face the consequences of their actions." He turned toward Marjorie. "Miss Whitcomb, your courage in coming forward, your truth, have been vital in unraveling this story. You have suffered unjustly, yet you have chosen the path of light." Marjorie's eyes glistened. "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot. I only hope that in speaking, I can help prevent others from being silenced." Poirot smiled warmly. "And you have. Justice is more than the verdict, it is the voice." He then addressed Lawrence. "You must now decide how to carry your family forward, to acknowledge the past without being imprisoned by it. To rebuild Windermere not as a monument to silence, but as a home of openness and honor." Lawrence met his gaze, the weight of responsibility settling firmly upon him. I will not let history repeat itself. Poirot's eyes rested on Lady Eugenia once more. Madame, your strength will be crucial in guiding this change. The past cannot be rewritten, but the future is always open. A silence filled the room, deep and contemplative. Then Inspector Graves stepped forward, his tone official yet respectful. Celestine Vale will be taken to the authorities for trial. The evidence is clear, and her confession will stand. The law will take its course. There were no protests. Poirot concluded, May justice be tempered with understanding, and may this house find peace at last. As the group dispersed, Poirot lingered a moment, gazing once more at the fading light outside. The story was over. The tale had been told, and in the quiet aftermath, there was the faintest hint of hope, of wounds beginning to heal, of silences finally broken. Chapter 18. The closing remark. The evening sun dipped low behind the distant hills, casting a warm, amber glow over Windermere Hall as its long shadows stretched across the gardens. Inside, the house felt lighter, as if some invisible weight had been lifted. The storm that had haunted the estate for days had finally broken, leaving behind a calmness that whispered of new beginnings. Hercule Poirot stood near the great fireplace in the drawing-room, his hands clasped behind his back, the faintest hint of a satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The others were gathered around in various states of quiet reflection. Lady Eugenia, dignified but softened. Lawrence, looking younger somehow, unburdened. Marjorie, steady and composed after the storm of revelations. And even Celestine Vale, whose fate was now sealed, but who faced it with the graceful composure of a poet accepting the final stanza. Poirot's voice broke the silence with its measured clarity. Mesdames et messieurs, we have come to the end of this tragic narrative, a tale writ in blood and ink, betrayal and silence. He paused, allowing the weight of those words to settle. This affair was more than a murder. It was a complex dance of human frailty, of pride and jealousy, ambition and desperation. Hugo Trentham was a man who stole voices and lives, yet he paid the ultimate price. Celestine Vale, driven by the theft of her art and spirit, wielded her dagger not just in anger, but in calculated artistry. Poirot turned slightly to Lady Eugenia. Madame, your resilience in the face of loss is admirable. The house that bears your name will, I trust, become a sanctuary of truth rather than secrets. Lady Eugenia inclined her head. I shall do all in my power. Monsieur Poirot. Poirot's gaze moved to Lawrence. You, monsieur, inherit not only the estate, but also the burden of its history. May you carry it with wisdom and courage. Lawrence nodded, a resolve hardening in his eyes. And to Miss Whitcomb, Poirot said kindly, your courage to speak the truth has been a beacon in the dark. It is often the quiet voices that carry the greatest power. Marjorie offered a small, grateful smile. Poirot's eyes then rested on Celestine, standing apart but dignified. Mademoiselle Vale, he said softly, your story is a cautionary tale about the fine line between creation and destruction. Art can inspire, but when wielded as a weapon, it wounds deeply. She met his gaze without flinching. Poirot allowed a moment before delivering his final reflection. Murder is a tragedy of silence, a secret locked away that screams in the stillness. But truth, mes amis, is the great liberator. It cuts through shadows. It reveals the hidden verse beneath all stories. He smiled warmly. As always, it is the little gray cells that guide us through the labyrinth. Not mere evidence or accusation, but the understanding of human nature, its beauty, its darkness, and its endless complexity. He took a graceful bow, and so, with justice served and stories told, I take my leave of Windermere Hall. May its halls echo with honesty from this day forward. The room remained silent for a heartbeat longer before Lady Eugenia stepped forward. Monsieur Poirot, the estate and I owe you a debt impossible to repay. Poirot smiled, his eyes twinkling with gentle humor. Madame, it is I who am indebted to witness such courage and resilience. With that, he turned and made his way to the door. Before stepping out into the dusk, he paused and looked back once more. Remember, mes amis, he said softly, in every silence lies a story waiting to be heard. Listen well, and you will never be lost. And with that, Hercule Poirot disappeared into the gathering twilight, his silhouette merging with the shadows, leaving behind a house no longer haunted by secrets, but filled with the promise of truth. The evening sun was a fading ember behind the hills, as it cast a warm, amber glow over Windermere Hall. The shadows stretched long across the sprawling gardens, softening the sharp edges of the estate's aged stonework and manicured hedges. Inside, the house had shifted, its heavy silence now imbued not with menace, but with the fragile peace of release. The storm that had so relentlessly battered both the weather and the hearts within these walls had at last passed, leaving behind an afterglow that promised, if only faintly, renewal. Hercule Poirot stood in the drawing-room by the grand fireplace, the flickering flames reflected in his thoughtful eyes. His posture was impeccable, his hands folded behind his back, but in his measured smile there lay the satisfaction of a job not only done, but done well. Around him gathered the remnants of a fractured household, Lady Eugenia with her grace slightly softened by sorrow, Lawrence, whose youthful defiance had yielded to a new-found resolve, Marjorie Whitcomb, steady and composed after the tumult of confessions, and Celestine Vale, poised with a dignified resignation, accepting the fate she had chosen with her own hand. Poirot's voice, calm and clear, broke the stillness of the room. Mesdames et messieurs, we have reached the final stanza of this dark and tangled tale, a story wrought in blood and ink, betrayal and silence. He paused, his words hanging in the air like the last note of a somber melody. This affair was never merely a murder. It was a tragic ballet of human frailty, pride clashing with jealousy, ambition shadowed by desperation. Hugo Trentham was a man who stole voices and lives alike, yet he himself paid the ultimate price. Mademoiselle Vale, impelled by the theft of her art and spirit, wielded her dagger not solely in fury, but as a calculated act of artistry. Poirot's gaze shifted to Lady Eugenia, who sat with hands folded tightly in her lap, her composure fragile but unbroken. Madame, your strength through these trials has been admirable. The house that bears your family's name shall, I trust, become a haven not of secrets, but of truth. Lady Eugenia inclined her head, her voice soft but resolute. I intend as much, Monsieur Poirot. This house will no longer be a prison of silence. Poirot then turned his eyes to Lawrence. Monsieur Trentham, you inherit not just this estate, but the weight of a history heavy with shadows. You have a duty to carry it with wisdom and courage, to break the chains of silence and dishonor. Lawrence, who had been standing somewhat apart, now squared his shoulders and met Poirot's gaze. I will not let the past define our future. The estate will be a place of openness from now on. Poirot nodded approvingly, then looked to Marjorie. And you, Miss Whitcomb, your bravery in speaking the truth has been a beacon in the darkness. It is often those with the quietest voices who possess the greatest strength." Marjorie smiled faintly, a tear shimmering in her eye. "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot. I hope my voice can help others find theirs." Poirot's eyes finally settled on Celestine, standing with the grace and solemnity of a poet accepting her final verse. "Mademoiselle Val, your story is a tragic reminder of the fine line between creation and destruction. Art inspires, yet wielded as a weapon, it can deeply wound." Celestine met his gaze without falter. Poirot's smile softened as he continued. "Murder is the silence of secrets, locked away and screaming in the stillness. But truth, mes amis, is the liberator. It pierces through the shadows and reveals the hidden verse beneath all stories." He paused, his voice growing warmer. "Today, it is the little gray cells that have guided us through the labyrinth, not merely evidence, but the understanding of human nature, its beauty, its darkness, and its endless complexity." He stepped back, bowing with elegant finality. "And so, with justice served and stories told, I take my leave of Windermere Hall. May its halls now echo with honesty, and its future be written not in silence, but in truth." The room remained hushed for a long moment before Lady Eugenia rose, her movements slow but purposeful. "Monsieur Poirot, we owe you a debt beyond words for the clarity and courage you have brought." Poirot's eyes twinkled with gentle humor. "Madame, it is I who am grateful to have borne witness to such strength and resilience." He turned toward the door. Before stepping into the gathering dusk, Poirot paused and looked back once more. "Remember, mes amis, in every silence lies a story waiting to be heard. Listen well, and you will never be lost." And with that, Hercule Poirot vanished into the twilight, his silhouette merging with the lengthening shadows, leaving behind a house no longer haunted by secrets, but filled with the promise of new beginnings.